Okay, so these are people who are not friendly to their government. If there's anyone who despised the culture of the Greek and the empire of the Romans, it was the Jews. They had a strong historical and religious reason to hate their government. And this is what they're playing into. Except for a small group of people who enjoyed political influence and power, the Herodians, maybe the Sadducees, maybe the chief priests, the rest of the people, by majority, they hated the Roman government. They hated the puppet governors that the Romans would appoint over them. There was a story we looked at in the evening service a couple weeks ago where the Jews had sent a delegation to Rome and said, we don't want Herod's sons ruling over us because their dad is corrupt and the sons are going to be just as corrupt. So keep that in your mind. They hated their government. This is not a question of, how do they feel about their government? Some are favorable, some, they hated their government, and this is the sentiment that they're going to bring into their question here. So the question is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Caesar, the Roman emperor, he has the Roman military, they oppress the people, they tax the people, they further their empire and oppress more people, they deal harshly with the people, they just tax them whenever they want, and they are thoroughly corrupt. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? It's a legitimate question. So, they're trying to trap him. Here's the way this works. If Jesus says yes, then he would be going against the people, because the people hated the government of Rome. So if they ask, is it lawful to pay taxes to Rome? And he says, well, yes. He would lose favor with the people. But if he says no, then they could take him to Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, and say, this man in the temple, he was teaching that we should not pay taxes to Caesar. What are you going to do about it? He's inciting rebellion against Rome. So it's a lose-lose situation that they present to Jesus and ask him for an answer. So this is their disingenuous way of questioning Jesus. And also, when they say, is it lawful? It was Roman law. But what they're saying is it lawful according to God's law? That's what the Jews always think about when they ask a question. Is it lawful to do this or that? They're saying, is it compatible with God's law? Does it work with the writings of Moses and the prophets? Is it lawful? Pay taxes to the Roman emperor. So if he says yes, he loses with the people. If he says no, he'll be accused of inciting a rebellion. And so this is a lose-lose situation. I love Jesus' response, though. Let's look at it. And it is in verse 23 and 24. It says, but he perceived their craftiness and said unto them, why tempt ye me? Show me a penny. That's an English translation of the Greek denarius. Denarius was a coin that was probably made of silver. It was a day's wages for a common laborer. Show me the denarius. Whose image and superscription hath it? And they said, Caesar's. Luke leaves out this detail, but Matthew is more specific about it. And he says to them, bring me a denarius. And they go, and they bring him the coin. Where would they have gotten that coin from? Well, maybe it was in their pockets. People carry around money. Maybe it was from the treasury of the temple, where a religious leader can go to the accounting department or wherever they have the treasure and say, hey, let me get a few coins. This guy has a question. We're trying to prove him wrong. Or it could have come from the money changers who may have been packing up and leaving at that point because Jesus had thrown them out. So, it says, bring me this coin. Show me the coin. Whose image and inscription is on it? Literally, whose icon, whose head is on, whose face, whose visage is on this coin, and whose whose inscription is on that coin? Who's writing? What does the coin say? What does it look like, and what does it say? Is the question. And the answer is Caesar's. These Roman coins, there were a variety of coins that, were different denominations, or different weights and different metals, which had different values. The Greek denarius, likely at that time, it had a rendering of Augustus Caesar, and it had his inscription, which referred to him as the divine Caesar, the son of the Most High God. In Latin, it would have said Maximus Pontiff, meaning the maximum, or the supreme father, the supreme ruler. And so his thing is, so Jesus says, well, if that's whose picture is on it, whose inscription is on it, then render it back to him. But what's brilliant about this is that he disarms their question by the way he responds to it. Here's how. He has them bring him a coin, which has an image, icon, face, visage of Caesar. How did the Jews feel about images? Were they favorable or not favorable to images? That's the second commandment. You shall not make unto thee any, you shall not make unto yourselves any graven image of any likeness that is in heaven or on the earth. And here they were, using money in exchange, in trade, in temple finance, and in temple exchange, which had Caesar's picture on it. And not only that, but it referred to Caesar as the divine Caesar, the Maximus Pontiff, the supreme ruler. It ascribed deity to Caesar. Their money, the system which they lived under, the Roman system, was already forcing them to break the first three commandments. Number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. Number 2, you shall not make unto thee any graven image of any likeness that is in the heaven above or on the earth beneath. And number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. That's what they're doing. That's what the system does when it ascribes to Caesar a title that only belongs to God. Amen. The supreme ruler, the divine ruler. And so it's like Jesus is saying, you know what? Your question is flawed because you've already brought into this flawed system. You already use this flawed system for its power and its resources. You've already brought into it. So here they are, pretending that they're concerned about their economy and their government and and justice, but they've already brought into this flawed system of Rome. They already live under it, and they use it to their advantage. Here's how we know that they use it to their advantage. It's not that they hated the system, but they used it to their advantage when they needed to. In fact, 4 days later, they go to Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate says, hey, I want nothing to do with your religious problems. You go deal with it yourself. They said, no, we can't. We need your authority to put this man to death. And he's like, well, what has he done? He hasn't really done anything. He said, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. We have no king but Caesar. This is how it ends up just 4 days after this. They're using the power of Rome to their advantage. They're manipulating it, and they're power playing it so that they can get their agenda met, which was the destruction of Jesus. So he says, bring me a coin. Whose image, whose inscription is it? Caesar's? Well, yeah, of course it's Caesar's. You've already brought into Caesar's corrupt system. You already live according to it. You already take advantage of it. You already let yourselves be taken advantage of by that system. So you use that system, render to Caesar the things that already belong to Caesar, but render to God what belongs to God. You see, just like with the coin, Caesar's image and inscription is on it. Where is God's image and inscription? Who's created the image of God? We are we not? Doesn't scriptures say that in Genesis, that we are created in the image of God. And so where God's image is, render that back to God, is what he is saying. Namely, you love him and worship him and serve him with the wholeness of your being. If Caesar is owed the coin, well, then more so, God is owed the thing which his image is on, namely, each one of us. Render to God the things that are God's. Okay, so there's a couple lessons before we look at the marriage question. There's a couple lessons for us. I want us to realize that simultaneously we live in two kingdoms at one time. We live in the kingdom of this world, and that's not always bad. It's not always a bad thing. Because we wake up each morning, we go to work each morning, we do labor, we get paid for it, we sustain ourselves and our families, and that's not bad. That's just an earthly thing. It's just part of living in this world. And simultaneously, we live in Christ. So we live with heavenly citizenship in this world. So simultaneously, we live in this world and we live a Christian life as well. In all things, we are to wholly render ourselves unto God, even as we live in this flawed system of this world. So, the game that is being played here is something that we do as well. When Christ tries to confront something in our lives, we tend to change the subject. Like the religious leaders did here. They're not all Pharisees. There are other ones involved here. That when he tells them this parable, which is about their own hearts and their own wickedness and how they're going to reject the grace and the love that he's trying to give them, they change the subject. So we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about the parable that you have said because it makes us angry. Let's have a discussion about the economy, about the government, about justice, about social problems. Let's do that. Let's not talk about our hearts. Let's avoid that topic. Let's talk about something else. Isn't it interesting that there's some people who are moral leaders or leaders in society or leaders in the government, are influential people who say all the right things, that we can even be impressed with the things they say. We say, that person is right on. But then you find out that the way that they have been living, the secret sins that they have been living in, whatever it might be, adultery or embezzlement or whatever, say, how could that happen? That person talked the right talk. And yet, their life, what they were doing with their life was so far from what God wants. You know, the reason for that is what we see in this passage. That the Pharisees talk the right talk. The religious leaders talk the right talk. But their hearts, they prevent their hearts from being engaged by God. We do that as well. That when God is trying to engage something in our hearts, when he's trying to point out some sin, some flaw, some imperfection, some wrong attitude, or some wrong way that we are living, we want to avoid that. So people want to have a mission without their heart being in it. They want to have service without submission. They want to have morality without transformation. And this happens all the time. Think of religious leaders, political leaders, influential people in society who say all the right things and have great influence. And then you look at their personal failures and you say, how could that happen in their lives? Because they had morality without their own hearts being transformed. It's like the same with the religious leaders. Say, hey, let's not talk about my heart. Let's talk about justice. Let's talk about the Roman government. Let's talk about the economy. Let's talk about taxes. Those are legitimate things to talk about, but the primary issue that Jesus is trying to confront is their hardness of heart. And they don't want to deal with that. This is a game that people play. When Christ is reaching out, when he is trying to touch their hearts, Okay, well, let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about me. Let's talk about society and the social problems. This is a game that Christians play as well. Sometimes we come to church and we listen to a message. You think, yep, that is about our society. Our society needs to hear that. Or the person sitting next to me needs to hear that. The person sitting across the room needs to hear that. It's not about me. I'm not going to let that touch my heart, but everyone else needs to hear that. This is a game we play, is it not? Of course it is. It's a game that we play. So, we think it's about everyone else except us. And this is why we have people who just have so much influence and power, and yet their personal failures are so great because they never let the very words that they are speaking influence their own heart, confront their own heart. So let's look at the second one, second game, okay? Marriage in the resurrection. So the question here, and it starts in verse 27. It's a little bit hard to understand the old King James, but I'll tell you what their question is. So they have an Old Testament law, a cultural law, which Moses allowed for. And what it says is that if a man marries a woman, that woman and that man ends up dying, his brother can take her as his wife, if she has no children, and raise up children to her, fulfill that obligation for her. That seems weird in our society. But in this society, where cultures stuck together as closely as they did, this was actually a way to protect women in this society. Here's why. So that a woman could not leave her homeland and her family and her people and marry into a family, and then the husband dies, and the family's like, well, hey, we're sorry for your loss. We'll let you stay in our family, and you can cook and clean for us. No, the woman had rights when she married into a family. And one of those rights was that she was allowed children. So there was an obligation. Someone could marry her. We see this in the book of Ruth. It was a relative that married her and raised up children for her. That was her right. The family was obligated to her. So this was not. This was a way to protect women from those cultures who would say, "Oh well, your husband died. Too bad for you." No, she had rights. She had there were obligations to her when she married into him. When she left everything to marry into your family, you had an obligation to that woman. And it was not to say, "Oh, your husband died. You can be our maid." No, it's not the way it worked. That was something God would not allow. The family had an obligation to that woman. And in the event that she became a widow, someone else from that family was supposed to marry her. If it was not a brother, it could have been another relative. The family had an obligation to her. So, they set this hypothetical situation and they say, well, one guy, he got married, he died, and then his brother, he ended up marrying that woman, and he died as well, and then the third brother ended up marrying her, and he died as well. You would think after the third brother, say, hey, this woman is bad luck. Let's not do this. But no, this is a hypothetical situation, right?